Marcus Webb sat in his small room aboard the transport ship and stared at the glowing message in front of him. The Galactic Federation had finally agreed to let one human teach at their famous military academy. After 3 years of paperwork and meetings, they had given humanity this single chance. Marcus was that chance. He read the assignment details again. He would teach something called theoretical combat scenarios to alien students who had never seen real war. The academy was located on a space station orbiting a planet called Harmony. Even the name made Marcus shake his head. These aliens had lived in peace for 200 years. They solved problems by talking, not fighting. Marcus looked at himself in the mirror. At 35, he had already fought in more battles than most Federation species had seen in their entire history. The scars on his arms told stories of close combat. The metal plate in his left leg reminded him of the siege of New Berlin. His eyes had seen things that would give these peaceful aliens nightmares for months. The transport ship shuddered as it prepared to jump to hyperspace. Marcus gathered his belongings and thought about what he was walking into. The Federation Military Academy was the most respected institution in known space. Their graduates became admirals, defense ministers, and peace negotiators. They learned strategy through computer simulations and historical analysis. None of them had ever held a real weapon or seen someone die in combat. Marcus had killed his first enemy soldier when he was 17 years old during the Food Wars. By the time he turned 20, he had seen 3 major cities burn. When the water conflict started, he was already a veteran commander. The 40-year war that consumed Earth had taught humanity lessons that no simulation could provide. The Federation had invited him to share human knowledge, but Marcus suspected they did not understand what they were asking for. They wanted to learn about theoretical combat, but humans had lived through the real thing. They wanted academic discussions about warfare, but Marcus could only teach from experience. They expected neat theories and clean strategies, but war was never neat or clean. As the ship jumped into hyperspace, Marcus reviewed the files on his future students. The Rilani were tall and elegant. They came from a world where disagreements were settled through meditation and philosophical debate. Violence was so rare among them that they had no words for many military concepts. Their idea of conflict was a heated discussion about art or poetry. The Corvani were shorter, but built like tanks. They were naturally defensive thinkers who preferred to solve problems by building better walls or stronger shields. They had never launched an offensive military action in their recorded history. When threatened, they simply made themselves harder to hurt and waited for the problem to go away. The Telani were quick and clever. They excelled at games and puzzles, always finding creative solutions to complex problems. Their military doctrine focused on outsmarting enemies rather than outfighting them. They believed any conflict that resulted in casualties was a failure of imagination. Then there were smaller groups from other species scattered throughout the Federation. All of them shared one thing in common. They had never experienced the kind of warfare that humans considered normal. The deadliest conflict in recent Federation history had resulted in 12 deaths and was remembered as a terrible tragedy. Humans had lost more people than that in training accidents. Marcus opened his personal files and looked at his service record. 237 confirmed enemy kills in direct combat, 41 successful siege operations, 89 raids behind enemy lines, 3 major battles where he had been the ranking survivor. The numbers seemed almost meaningless now, just statistics from another life, but those numbers represented knowledge that could not be found in books or simulations. They represented an understanding of warfare that came from living through it, breathing it, and surviving it. Marcus had learned how to make impossible decisions under pressure. He knew what it felt like to sacrifice good soldiers to save better positions. He understood the mathematics of death that kept armies moving forward when every instinct screamed to retreat. The transport ship dropped out of hyperspace and Marcus saw the academy for the first time. It was beautiful in the way that only peaceful civilizations could build. Gleaming metal and transparent materials formed elegant curves that caught and reflected the light from the nearby star. Gardens were visible through the transparent sections, bringing life and color to the sterile perfection of space. Everything about it spoke of a culture that had never needed to think about defense or survival. Marcus gathered his few possessions and prepared to disembark. His military bag contained everything he owned, some clothes, a few personal items, and his teaching materials. The teaching materials were what worried him most. How do you explain the reality of war to people who think violence is theoretical? How do you describe the weight of command decisions when your students have never made a choice that could kill someone? The docking procedure was smooth and quiet. Even the mechanical systems on this station seemed designed for peace and comfort. Marcus walked through corridors lined with artwork and displays showing the great diplomatic achievements of Federation history. Treaty signings, peace negotiations, and conflict resolutions were celebrated like military victories. Might be on human worlds. He reached his assigned quarters and found them larger and more comfortable than anything he had lived in during his military service. The room had a real window that looked out at the planet below. Harmony was green and blue, unmarked by the industrial scars or defensive installations that covered most human worlds. It looked like a painting of what Earth might have been if the wars had never started. Marcus unpacked his belongings and sat down at the desk provided for him. Tomorrow he would meet his students for the first time. Tomorrow he would begin trying to teach the reality of warfare to species that had never experienced it. Tomorrow he would discover whether peaceful aliens could learn the hard lessons that had cost humanity so much to master. He looked out at the peaceful planet below and wondered if he was about to shatter something beautiful and irreplaceable. The Federation had asked for a teacher, but Marcus was bringing knowledge that could not be unlearned. Once his students understood what humans knew about war, they would never see the universe the same way again. Marcus Webb closed his eyes and prepared for the most difficult assignment of his career. The lecture hall was exactly what Marcus had expected from a peaceful civilization. Soft lighting created a warm atmosphere while curved walls eliminated harsh angles that might cause stress. The seats were designed for comfort rather than efficiency, and everything was painted in calming colors that promoted thoughtful discussion rather than urgent action. 60 alien students filled the seats, representing 12 different species from across the Federation. They chatted quietly among themselves, in their various languages, creating a gentle murmur that sounded more like a garden party than a military classroom. Marcus noticed how they moved with grace and confidence, never checking corners or exits, never positioning themselves with their backs protected. These were beings who had never learned to be afraid. Marcus entered the room and the conversation stopped immediately. 60 pairs of eyes turned toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely hidden disdain. He could see what they were thinking. He was the representative of the newest species in the Federation, the violent primitives from a backwards world who had somehow earned a place at their prestigious academy. He walked to the front of the room without introducing himself and activated the holographic display system. The Federation technology was impressive, creating three-dimensional images that seemed solid enough to touch. Marcus had prepared carefully for this moment, choosing his first lesson with the same care a surgeon might choose where to make the first cut. The display showed a simple question in multiple languages. How many of you have been in a life or death situation? Marcus looked around the room and waited. The students looked at each other with confusion. Several raised tentacles or appendages hesitantly, then lowered them when they realized others were not responding. Finally, the silence stretched long enough that Marcus knew he had his answer. No one, he said quietly. How many of you have seen death? This time a few hands rose from different sections. A Kavani student explained that she had been present when her grandfather died peacefully at the age of 300. A Talani mentioned seeing animals die during his biological studies. Another spoke of witnessing an accident where someone had been injured but recovered fully. Marcus nodded and changed the display. Today we will examine the Battle of New Singapore. By human standards, this was a minor engagement. 200 human soldiers held a strategic position against 800 attackers for 72 hours. The holographic display created a three-dimensional map of the battlefield. Marcus highlighted key positions and explained the tactical situation with the same calm tone he might use to discuss the weather. He showed supply lines, defensive positions, and movement patterns. Everything looked clean and organized in the simulation. Then he added the casualty numbers. The display showed 1,247 dead and 3,891 wounded in neat, glowing text. The room went completely silent. Marcus watched as alien faces changed from interest to shock to something approaching horror. He could smell stress pheromones in the air as various species began releasing chemical signals of distress. Young Rilani in the front row made a strangled sound and toppled sideways out of her chair. Two classmates rushed to help her while making high-pitched sounds of distress. Other students began talking rapidly in their native languages, and Marcus caught enough words to know they were asking if the numbers were real. This battle lasted 3 days, Marcus continued as if nothing had happened. We considered it a light engagement. There were 47 other battles happening at the same time across different continents. The casualties I showed you represent less than 1% of the total deaths that week. A Talani student raised his hand with a shaking appendage. Professor Webb, surely those numbers are theoretical. No civilization could sustain such losses. Marcus looked at the young alien and saw genuine confusion in his large eyes. Those numbers are from historical records. I was present at New Singapore. I commanded the Eastern Defensive Position. The room erupted in shocked chatter. Students turned to each other, trying to process what they had heard. Several made sounds of distress, while others began asking rapid questions in multiple languages. The environmental systems in the room activated automatically, working to clear the stress pheromones and regulate temperature as 60 alien nervous systems went into overdrive. Marcus waited for quiet to return. The engagement at New Singapore was notable not because of the casualties, but because we held the position. The mission was successful. We prevented 8,000 civilians from being killed by sacrificing less than 2,000 soldiers. Kovani students stood up abruptly. You speak of sacrifice as if it were mathematics. In war, everything is mathematics, Marcus replied. You calculate acceptable losses against strategic gains. You measure the value of positions against the cost of holding them. You determine how many lives you can spend to save more lives elsewhere. The Kovani student sat down heavily, his thick arms shaking. Around the room, other students were having similar reactions. Some looked sick, others appeared angry, and a few seemed to be reconsidering everything they thought they knew about their newest Federation members. Marcus changed the display again. Human military doctrine is based on a simple principle. The enemy is trying to kill you, and you must kill them first. Every strategy, every tactic, every decision comes back to this fundamental truth. There is no alternative outcome except death. A Rilani professor, who had been observing from the back of the room, stood up. Instructor Webb, surely you cannot mean that every conflict must end in death. The Federation has resolved thousands of disputes through negotiation and compromise. Marcus looked at the professor with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Professor, the conflicts you have resolved were not wars. They were disagreements between civilized beings who shared common values. War happens when you face an enemy who wants everything you have and is willing to kill everyone you love to take it. The room fell silent again. Marcus could see his students struggling to understand concepts that had no equivalent in their peaceful experience. They were trying to fit his words into their existing worldview, but the pieces did not match. Next week, Marcus said as he prepared to end the lesson, we will discuss siege warfare and the acceptable rate of civilian casualties during urban combat. Please review the materials I will send to your personal devices. Some of you may want to speak with counselors before our next meeting. As the students filed out of the room, Marcus heard fragments of conversation in multiple languages. Words like impossible, barbaric, and terrifying appeared in several discussions. A few students looked back at him with something that might have been fear. Marcus began packing his materials and wondered if the Federation really understood what they had asked for when they invited humanity to share their knowledge. Word of Marcus Webb's first lecture spread through the academy faster than a computer virus. By the second day, his classroom was packed beyond capacity. Students who were not enrolled in his course found excuses to observe. Senior instructors claimed they were conducting educational reviews. Even administrative staff discovered reasons to be present during his lessons. Marcus had learned from the shock of his first class and adapted his teaching approach. He now presented human warfare through the lens of survival rather than aggression. Instead of starting with casualty numbers, he began with the circumstances that forced humans to develop their particular skills in combat. Earth experienced what we call the 40-year war, Marcus explained to his expanded audience. It began with resource scarcity and ended with our planet divided into hundreds of armed territories. Every human settlement learned to fight or cease to exist. The holographic display showed Earth as it had been during the worst years of conflict. Continents were marked with different colors representing the various factions, alliances, and independent territories. Trade routes were highlighted in red where they passed through combat zones. Safe areas appeared as small green islands in an ocean of yellow warning zones and red danger areas. Children learned basic tactical awareness before they learned to read, Marcus continued. Every civilian understood concepts like fields of fire, cover versus concealment, and casualty triage. These skills were not military training. They were survival skills necessary for daily life. A Talani student raised her hand tentatively. Instructor Webb, how did your people accomplish anything productive if they were constantly fighting? Marcus smiled at the question. We became extremely efficient. When you might lose your factory to enemy action at any time, you learn to build quickly and relocate easily. When your supply lines are constantly under attack, you develop flexible logistics. When your workforce might be drafted for combat, you train everyone to perform multiple jobs. He changed the display to show productivity statistics from human worlds during the war years. Despite constant conflict, human manufacturing, agriculture, and innovation had actually increased compared to pre-war levels. The need to survive had forced rapid advancement in every field. Competition drives improvement, Marcus explained. When the cost of falling behind is extinction, civilizations advance quickly. Humans developed technologies in 40 years that might have taken 2 centuries under peaceful conditions. A Corvani instructor who had been observing from the back raised his thick arm. But surely the cost in lives was not worth such advancement, Marcus considered the question carefully. Every human who died in those wars would disagree with you, if they could. But their deaths ensured that billions of other humans would survive. We developed medical technologies that saved more lives than the wars cost. We created defensive systems that prevented even larger conflicts. We learned lessons that protected future generations. The room was completely silent as students and observers tried to process this perspective. They came from cultures where even accidental death was treated as a major tragedy. The idea that planned death could serve a greater purpose was alien to their thinking. Let me ask you a question, Marcus said, looking around the room. If an enemy force was advancing toward a city containing 1 million civilians and you could stop them by sacrificing 1,000 soldiers, what would you do? Hands went up around the room. Negotiate with the enemy, called out a Rulani. Find an alternative solution, suggested a Talani. Evacuate the civilians, offered a Corvani. Marcus nodded patiently. What if negotiation fails because the enemy does not communicate? What if there is no alternative solution because you have already tried everything? What if evacuation is impossible because you do not have enough time or transport? The hands went down. Students looked at each other with growing discomfort as they realized where the question was leading. In human military doctrine, the answer is simple, Marcus said quietly. You sacrifice the 1,000 to save the million. You make the hard choice because no one else can make it for you. You accept the responsibility and the guilt because the alternative is worse? A young Rilani in the front row spoke up with a trembling voice. But who gives you the right to decide who lives and who dies? Marcus looked at her with genuine sympathy. No one gives you that right. You take it because someone must, and you are the one in position to act. Command is not about authority. Command is about accepting responsibility for decisions that no one should have to make. The display changed again to show a tactical scenario from the siege of Mumbai. Marcus walked them through the decision points where human commanders had chosen to sacrifice smaller units to save larger ones. He explained the mathematics of acceptable losses and the psychological training required to function under such pressure. How do your commanders sleep at night? Asked a Talani student. Many of them do not sleep well, Marcus admitted. We have medical treatments for the psychological damage caused by combat command. But we consider this damage acceptable because the alternative is losing wars that protect billions of innocent people. As the lesson continued, Marcus noticed a change in his audience. The initial shock was giving way to a different kind of attention. Students were taking notes and asking technical questions. They were beginning to think about warfare as a practical problem rather than a theoretical horror. Next week, we will discuss the concept of total war, Marcus announced as the class period ended. Please review the materials on resource mobilization and civilian integration into military production. Some of you may find the reading disturbing. After the students left, several senior instructors approached Marcus. Admiral Kent, the Academy's Director of Strategic Studies, spoke first. Instructor Webb, your teaching methods are creating significant discussion among faculty and students. Marcus nodded. I imagine they are. Human perspectives on warfare tend to have that effect. Some of my colleagues are concerned that you are teaching our students to think like killers rather than strategists. Marcus considered his response carefully. Admiral strategy without the willingness to implement it is just academic exercise. I am teaching your students what implementation actually means. Professor Yenth, an elderly Rilani, stepped forward. But surely there must be alternatives to such brutal pragmatism. Professor, if alternatives exist, humans will find them, Marcus replied. We prefer to win wars without fighting them. But when fighting becomes necessary, we have learned to be very good at it. As the instructors left, Marcus remained in the empty classroom and looked out at the peaceful station around him. His students were beginning to understand human warfare, but he wondered if they could learn to think like humans without losing the qualities that made their civilizations worth protecting. Admiral Threnax of the Corvani Defense Fleet paced back and forth in his private office aboard the Academy station. Through his windows, he could see the peaceful planet Harmony rotating slowly below, its surface unmarked by the defensive installations that would soon become necessary. The reports scattered across his desk told a story that filled him with growing alarm. The human instructor had been teaching for 6 weeks, and the changes in the student body were becoming impossible to ignore. Alien cadets who had arrived thinking about defense and diplomacy were now submitting tactical analyses that called for preemptive strikes and acceptable casualty rates. Young beings who had never seen violence were discussing the strategic value of terror tactics and psychological warfare. Most disturbing of all, they were getting good at it. Threnax picked up the latest assignment from Cadet Vex, the young Rilani who had fainted during Webb's first lecture. Her analysis of the Kepler border dispute suggested a solution that would have ended the conflict in 3 days instead of the 6 months of negotiation it had actually required. Her proposed method involved a calculated show of force that would have resulted in approximately 300 deaths but prevented the economic damage that had cost thousands of lives over the following years. The mathematics were sound. The strategy was brilliant. The moral implications were terrifying. Threnax activated his communication system and called an emergency meeting of the Academy's board of directors. Within an hour, 12 of the Federation's most senior military leaders had gathered in the Academy's main conference room. The discussion that followed would determine humanity's future in the Federation military structure. "This human is corrupting our students," Threnax began without preamble. "They are learning to think like predators instead of protectors. Yesterday, a Talani cadet asked me about the strategic value of orbital bombardment. A Corvani student submitted a paper on the psychological effects of public executions. These concepts were unknown to our species before Webb arrived." Defense Minister Yorth, a pragmatic Talani with silver skin and large dark eyes, leaned forward in his chair. "Admiral, perhaps the question is not whether our students are being corrupted, but whether we have been naive. The humans have been our allies for 10 years, but we have never truly understood what we are dealing with. They are barbarians," declared General Kess, a R'Lani commander known for his philosophical approach to military problems. "Their entire culture is built around organized violence. They speak of death the way we speak of weather patterns. And yet," countered Admiral Forth of the Talani fleet, "they have never lost a conflict since joining the Federation. When pirates attacked the Centauri colonies, human security forces eliminated the threat in 18 hours. When separatists seized the mining stations at Volf 359, human negotiators ended the crisis without a single civilian casualty." Threnax pulled up holographic displays showing human military performance over the past decade. The numbers were impressive and disturbing. In equal measure, human forces had a perfect success rate in military operations, but they achieved this success through methods that made other Federation species uncomfortable. "Look at their tactics," Threnax said, highlighting specific operations. "They always assume the worst-case scenario. They prepare for casualties that never materialize. They plan for enemies who fight to the death even when facing opponents who prefer to surrender." "Perhaps," suggested Minister Yorth quietly, "that is exactly why they never experience those worst-case scenarios. Their enemies know what humans are capable of." The debate was interrupted by an urgent communication from the Federation Intelligence Division. Director Plex, an ancient Corvani with cybernetic enhancements, appeared as a full-size hologram in the center of the conference room. "I apologize for interrupting your meeting," Director Plex said without preamble, "but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Long-range sensors have detected massive energy signatures in the dark space beyond the galactic rim." The conference room fell silent. Dark space was the region beyond the edge of the galaxy where no stars existed and no civilized species had ever ventured. Nothing had ever emerged from that empty void in the entire recorded history of the Federation. "What kind of energy signatures?" asked Minister Yorth. "The patterns match archived data from the Devourer War 50 years ago," Director Plex replied. "They are returning." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Every being present had studied the historical records of the Devourer War, though none had lived through it. The Devourers were a machine intelligence that consumed entire civilizations, converting organic matter into raw materials for their expanding fleet. They had appeared from dark space 50 years ago, destroyed 12 civilizations, and then vanished as suddenly as they had arrived. The Federation had survived the first Devourer War through evacuation and hiding rather than direct confrontation. Their peaceful philosophy and advanced diplomatic skills had been useless against enemies that did not communicate and showed no interest in negotiation. The war had ended when the Devourers simply left, apparently satisfied with whatever they had accomplished. "How long do we have?" asked Admiral Threnax. "Based on their current trajectory and speed, they will reach the outer systems in approximately 6 weeks," Director Plex responded. "The first inhabited worlds will be under threat in 8 weeks." The room erupted in concerned chatter as commanders began calculating response times and evacuation schedules. But Minister Yorth raised his hand for silence and asked the question that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to voice. "Director Plex, do we have any indication of why they have returned? What do they want this time?" The holographic figure paused before responding. "Intelligence analysis suggests they are not returning for the same reasons as before. This time, their fleet composition is different. They appear to be configured for extended occupation rather than resource extraction. Occupation of what? Demanded General Kess. Everything, Director Plex replied simply. Long-range scans indicate a fleet of 47 major vessels, each capable of maintaining autonomous operations indefinitely. They are not planning to take what they need and leave. They are planning to stay. The silence that followed was deafening. Federation military doctrine was based on the assumption that conflicts could be resolved through negotiation, compromise, or strategic withdrawal. None of those options applied to an enemy that wanted complete occupation of all. Federation territory. Admiral Threnax looked around the room at his colleagues and saw the same realization in their eyes. The Federation military was not prepared for this kind of war. They had ships designed for patrol and defense, but no experience with the kind of total warfare that would be required to stop the DVOURERs. But one species in the Federation did have that experience. We need the human, Minister Yorth said quietly. Not just Instructor Webb, we need human military doctrine, human strategic thinking, and human tactical expertise. They will teach us to become killers, warned General Kess. If we do not learn to kill, Threnax replied grimly, there will be no one left to remember what we used to be. The board voted unanimously to request immediate military assistance from Earth. For the first time in Federation history, they would ask their allies. Not for ships or supplies, but for knowledge of how to fight a war they could not afford to lose. 3 weeks after the emergency meeting, the Devourer fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Centauri system like a swarm of mechanical locusts. 47 vessels, each the size of a space station, moved in perfect formation toward the inhabited worlds. Their hulls were dark metal that seemed to absorb light, and they transmitted no communications despite repeated attempts by Federation diplomats. Marcus Webb stood in the Academy's main command center, surrounded by alien officers who had spent their careers planning for conflicts that could be resolved through negotiation. The massive display screens showed tactical information that painted a grim picture. The Devourer fleet was advancing at a steady pace that would bring them to Centauri Prime in exactly 16 hours. The Federation response was everything Marcus had expected from a peaceful civilization facing an existential threat: evacuation. Ships were loading civilians from the outer colonies while defense fleets moved into protective formations around major population centers. Diplomatic teams continued broadcasting peace overtures in hundreds of languages, hoping to establish communication with an enemy that showed no interest in talking. Admiral Threnax stood at the Central Command Console, coordinating the largest military operation in Federation history. His face showed the strain of commanding forces in a type of conflict he had never imagined possible. Around him, staff officers struggled to adapt peacetime procedures to wartime realities. Evacuation of Centauri 7 is proceeding on schedule, reported a Tylani communications officer. All civilian populations will be clear in 12 hours. The defensive fleet has taken position around Centauri Prime, added a Corvani tactical specialist. All ships are maintaining protective formation as planned. Marcus watched the tactical display and felt a familiar frustration. The Federation was fighting the last war instead of the current one. They were positioning their forces to minimize casualties rather than maximize effectiveness. They were preparing for a siege they could not win instead of seeking advantages they might exploit. Cadet Vex approached him with a data tablet clutched in her graceful hands. The young Rilani had changed dramatically over the past few weeks. Her philosophical training remained, but she now viewed problems through the practical lens that Marcus had taught her. Instructor Webb, she said quietly, I have been analyzing the Devourer fleet composition using human tactical principles. Marcus took the tablet and reviewed her work. The analysis was thorough and demonstrated an understanding of warfare. That would have been impossible for her just 2 months earlier. She had identified weaknesses in the enemy formation and suggested methods of exploitation that no Federation commander would have considered. What is your assessment, Cadet? Marcus asked. Using Federation doctrine, we cannot win. With the calm certainty of someone who had learned to think mathematically about death, Our defensive positions will delay them by perhaps 6 hours. Our evacuation procedures will save 30% of the civilian population. The remaining 70% will be killed or captured when our defenses fail, Marcus nodded. And using human doctrine? Vex activated the holographic display and showed her alternative tactical plan. We sacrifice the outer colonies immediately. To concentrate our forces, we use civilian ships as guided weapons against their capital vessels. We accept that 50,000 people will die in order to save 50 million. The command center fell silent as other officers realized what they were hearing. A young Relani who had fainted at the mention of battlefield casualties was now calmly proposing to sacrifice entire worlds to achieve strategic objectives. Admiral Threnax approached them with heavy steps. Instructor Webb, the Federation Council, has requested your immediate input on defensive strategies. Marcus looked at the Admiral and saw an alien commander who had spent his entire career preparing for conflicts that would never come. Now he faced an enemy that threatened everything he had sworn to protect, and his peaceful training provided no solutions. Admiral, what specific input are you requesting? Marcus asked. Tell us how to save our people, Threnax replied simply. Marcus activated the command center's main display and overlaid Cadet Vex's tactical analysis with real-time sensor data. The Devourer fleet appeared as red icons moving steadily toward the blue symbols representing Federation forces. You cannot save everyone, Marcus said with the directness that had characterized all his teaching. The enemy fleet is superior in numbers, technology, and tactical positioning. Any attempt to protect all Federation assets will result in the loss of all Federation assets. He highlighted specific elements of the enemy formation. However, the Devourers are machines following programmed instructions. They expect you to behave according to your established patterns. They have calculated their approach based on Federation historical responses to threats. The display changed to show alternative fleet positions. Human doctrine would concentrate all available forces against their command vessel while sacrificing everything else. We would accept the complete loss of the outer systems in order to eliminate their central coordination. But millions of people live in those outer systems, protested a Talani officer. Millions of people live in the inner systems as well, Marcus replied. If you try to save everyone, you will save no one. If you save who you can, some will survive. To rebuild? Admiral Threnax studied the tactical display with the expression of someone learning to see the universe differently. What are the chances of success using your proposed strategy? Marcus considered the question carefully. 40% chance of eliminating the command vessel. 60% chance of reducing their overall effectiveness enough to force withdrawal. 100% chance that everyone in the outer systems dies. And if we maintain current defensive positions? 0% chance of eliminating the command vessel. 10% chance of forcing withdrawal. 100% chance that everyone in all systems dies. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Around the command center, Federation. Officers struggled to accept calculations that reduced millions of lives to strategic variables. Cadet Vex stepped forward and addressed Admiral Threnax directly. Sir, Instructor Webb has taught us that war is not about making good choices. War is about making the least terrible choice available. Admiral Threnax looked at the young Relani who had learned to think like a human warrior. Cadet, do you recommend implementing the human tactical plan? Yes, sir, Vex replied without hesitation. We cannot save everyone, but we can save someone. That is better than saving no one. Threnax turned to Marcus. Instructor Webb, will you assume tactical command of this operation? Marcus looked around. The command center had alien faces that had learned to accept the terrible mathematics of warfare. Admiral, I will provide advisory support, but this must be a Federation operation commanded by Federation officers. Your people need to learn these lessons for themselves. Admiral Threnax nodded slowly and activated the fleet communication system. All Federation forces, this is Fleet Command. We are implementing immediate tactical redeployment. Outer system defense fleets will withdraw to concentrated positions around Centauri Prime. civilian evacuation will be suspended in favor of offensive preparations. As the orders went out, Marcus watched Federation ships begin moving according to human tactical doctrine. Peaceful beings were preparing to fight a war using lessons learned from humanity's violent history. The transformation was both necessary and tragic. The Devourer fleet continued its advance, unaware that their enemies had just learned to think like predators.